I have to wonder if local comic shops have a case for a class action lawsuit. All images in this video are used under fair use of United States copyright law of 1976 and are used in conjunction with my commentary. Coming to paperback and e-readers, John Haynes, Godbreaker. The man who rules the world takes on the Asgardian god of thunder in this action-packed, all-new John Haynes series adventure. Pre-order your copy of John Haynes Godbreaker at online booksellers today. I was on Twitter Thursday night when I saw a tweet by someone called the Quest Bro where he talked about how his local comic shop was closing. And as he posted some pictures of his local comic shop that was closing, he said that everything in this shop was 75% off, and he broke it down in a series of pictures. Now, in the first two pictures, he showed a series of Western comics from publishers like Marvel and DC Comics, and the shelves were basically full of these Marvel and DC comics. And in the third picture, where he showed the store that was closing, it was supposed to be a section of manga, and the entire manga section was empty at this point. And in the fourth section, which was supposed to be Wargaming and Warhammer paints, there was literally next to nothing on the shelf. And as I looked at the pictures that the Quest Bro showed of his comic shop that was closing, I had to ask myself a critical question. Do comic shop owners have a case for filing a class action lawsuit against comic publishers like Marvel and DC Comics? And I believe that many of these comic shops, which have been closing ever since the days of the all-new, all-different Marvel, which launched, I believe, in 2016 or so, they saw their sales drop by 97% over at the Marvel side. And then on the DC side, comic sales have been dropping ever since Dan Didio took over in 2002, and then took an even more precipitous slide after 2011 when DC Comics decided to reboot their universe with the New 52. And I believe that it was as a result of these publishers changing direction of their characters. I believe that many comic shops actually have a good, strong case for a class action lawsuit against Warner Brothers Discovery and Disney for their Marvel and DC Comics divisions, providing them with extremely poor quality product that prevented them from being able to make sales. Now, most comic shops stay primarily in business due to comic sales. However, many have been forced to adapt because the industry continues to create poor quality product, and they have to switch and go into selling things like merchandise and selling things like manga and Warhammer paints and video games in order to stay afloat. And I believe that there is a case for suing Warner Brothers Discovery and Disney for Marvel and DC providing these shops with poor quality product, because over the last couple of years we have seen hundreds of comic shops close, and many comic shop owners are saying that one of the reasons why they were forced to close is because they could not be able to sell many of the comics in the Marvel and DC catalog. And I believe that this case is actually reinforced by the distribution system that had been controlled by Diamond for years, because Diamond was the comic distributor that became a monopoly. And as it became a monopoly as related to Marvel going out and buying Heroes World, which led to the collapse of the entire distribution system, that many comic shops were forced to buy both Marvel and DC Comics through Diamond, and as a result of buying them through Diamond, many of these shops could not return any of these books like many in trade publishing could, because in trade publishing, if you launch a book and it does not sell, what happens is you can take all of those books that don't sell at a place like a Barnes & Noble, a Walmart, or Amazon, and you can return them for credit towards the next next series of books from that publisher. So if that publisher has a new catalog of books, like I have with the SJS Direct 2023 catalog, if a retailer does not sell a book from 2022, what they can do is return all of those books once the new books are announced for store credit. And what this does is it makes it where the publisher has to go out and ensure that the product is of quality, because in order to maintain their retail space, what they have to do is continue providing quality product, because if you don't provide quality product and there's nothing, and you don't bring anything good to the shelf, what happens is the retailer takes that space away, and that's something that many publishers don't want to happen. So what they do is insist that their writers go out and write books of high quality so that they can maintain their shelf space at retailers such as Barnes & Noble and other local booksellers, and can continue to get distribution for their titles at online platforms like Amazon. So they want to maintain a reputation for their products, and that's why many trade publishers will go out here and demand that writers go out here and make sure that their books are of the highest quality, that their stories are well written, that their stories feature compelling heroes and heroines, and that their stories have a plot that actually makes sense. Unfortunately, in the comic book industry, there is no retail standard, because most comic shops usually just go out here and buy most of these books. And because they buy most of these books and there is no return policy, usually it's the comic shop that is the one that is stuck with a series of bad titles, and they are the ones who have to eat the cost and hope to try to make up basically the cost of the book if they put that book in a place like the 50-cent bin or the quarter bin. And what's been happening these days, due to companies like Marvel and DC basically lowering their standards for editorial, is that many of the comics they're producing are not of any sort of quality, and they've been basically sticking the cost onto the comic book shop, who have been trying to absorb the losses from many of these comic books that usually feature incredibly bad writing, incredibly terrible art, and in many cases just have poor editorial, because in some cases some books have poor grammar, punctuation, and spelling. These books are of extremely poor quality, yet many companies like Marvel and DC insist on offering these books to comic publishers and are telling them to just keep taking the losses. And what's sad is that as these comic shops continue to try to take the losses on what many call these SJW and rebooted books, they wind up hitting a point where that store can no longer absorb any more losses, and they wind up having to closing their business, because there's no way they can go out here and sell any of these products. That's what's been happening to comic shops ever since about 2014 or 2016, when Marvel Comics launched the all-new, all-different Marvel, and also happened with DC when they did their Convergence and the other types of storylines that they did, like Dark Crisis and not Final Crisis, but Dark Crisis, and I believe it was something that featured Wally West as this killer. All of these kind of storylines, they have been turning readers off, and instead of Warner Brothers Discovery and Disney demanding that Marvel and DC Comics step up their game, the standards continue to decline, with comic shops having to continue absorbing the losses year after year. And that's where I believe that comic shops really have a strong case for a class action lawsuit, because their livelihoods depended on companies like Marvel and DC providing them with quality comics that they would be able to sell. and they're not getting quality comics that they're able to sell due to many creators at Marvel looking to push self-insert characters and social justice narratives, and the same thing over at DC, where they continue to push these self-insert characters and social justice narratives, and in addition continue to retcon their continuity whenever they wind up painting themselves in a corner with bad writing. And I believe that many of these bad comics are the equivalent of a Ford Pinto, a small hatchback that came out in the 1970s. Now, Ford knew that there was a design defect with the Ford Pinto, and if this car was hit in the back, there could be a possibility of this vehicle exploding and possibly killing the driver and other individuals who were in the vicinity of this vehicle if it was in an accident. And due to a class action lawsuit, Ford was forced to go out here and recall most of those Pintos and absorb the cost for those Pintos that were defective. And I believe the same thing needs to be done over at Warner Brothers Discovery and Disney to recompense many of these comic shop owners who basically lost their business as a result of many of those in editorial who lowered their standards, hired grossly unqualified people to work on many of their comics, went out here and approved stories that basically were of poor quality, went out here and did not demand that artists finish art, did not demand that coloring be of high quality. These are all things that only Marvel and DC are responsible for, and the shop owner, they cannot go out here and sell a product if the product is actively defective, if the product is poorly designed and poorly made, and the retailer has to take said product, or in some cases, like I have heard, where you had companies like Marvel and Diamond shipping books that many shop owners did not order, like in the case was alleged as related to the Patsy Walker Hellcat book. Many people said that they were getting these so-called SJW titles inside of their boxes as they were ordering other books, and they didn't want to order these low-selling books, but Marvel would send out these low-selling books, and they would be wound up stuck with these books. And that's where I believe that there is a strong case for a class action lawsuit against Warner Brothers Discovery and Disney's Marvel and DC divisions, because it's the comic shop owner who has to take the loss at the end of the day. It is the comic shop owner who winds up having to buy these books sight unseen, and it's the comic shop owner who has to wind up eating the cost of these books, because they believe that since this character is popular, they believe that this character has a following, they believe that this book will be able to generate sales, and they're not able to generate sales or make money on these books. Now, another argument I believe that would be strong for this case is the bait and switch that took place during the all-new, all-different Marvel, because at the height of the popularity of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, where comic shops would be able to get a boom in profit, many comic shops were saddled with extremely poor quality product because Marvel decided to willfully and intentionally replace many of the characters with what some claim to be token diversity heroes, such as the Amadeus Cho Hulk, the female Thor, Riri Williams Ironheart, and Sam Wilson Captain America. Now, while we were seeing Bruce Banner, Steve Rogers, Tony Stark, and Peter Parker in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, we were not allowed to go to the comic shop and buy those same characters. So I believe that there is another argument for the class action lawsuit, in addition to Marvel and DC providing poor quality books, that they could go out here and make the case, oh, we were not able to make sales because they did not feature the characters that were in the movies, so we were not able to capitalize on the synergy. So I believe that there is a case for a comic shop to create this class action lawsuit. And I also believe that there's other points to reinforce the argument, such as many of the writers they hired at that time, such as Mariko Tamaki, who was grossly unqualified to write any comics, or many of the other what they call SJW creators. Many of these people did not have a background in comics, and again, the argument could be made that these individuals hurt the business of many of these comic shops, and the argument could be made that it was these people's policies that led to many comic shops having to take losses in sales because there was no quality product being provided to them, and because they were being provided with defective product, this caused their business to suffer, and as a result of their business suffering, many comic shops were forced to close all across the country. So I'm seeing the foundations for a solid class action lawsuit against Marvel, DC, and many other comic companies, because many of what they call the SJW comics that are produced today are, again, of the poorest quality, and the customer has no incentive to buy a defective product, because if a product is defective, if a product is of poor quality, then the customer doesn't have a reason to buy it, and the shop owner should not have to take the loss if the company is producing the poor quality product. Now, I know that DC has now signed a deal with distribution with Penguin Random House, and there's possibly returnability, but that doesn't help the comic shop owner who continues to take losses every day, because the core foundation of why they're taking losses is due to the fact that editorial is not held up to a high standard, and because editorial is not held up to the same high standard that many of the trade books are, what's happening is that the comic shop owner is the one who has to take those losses, and it's the comic shop owner who has to try to supplement their business with things like manga and things like gaming in order to try to pull a profit. But their core business is supposed to be comics, and if the comics being produced by the comic publisher are not of quality, then it's time for those publishers to be held accountable, as I see it, because it's those publishers' efforts to go out here and change their product to fit an identity politics agenda that pushes social justice instead of storytelling that is costing many of these comic shops their business, and it's been costing them their business for years. And again, this is where I see a strong case for going out and all of these comic shops that have closed over the last couple of years, filing that class action lawsuit in order to get compensatory damages and also to get punitive damages, because again, many of these comic publishers knew that many of the people they were hiring, like your G. Willow Wilsons, your Mariko Tamakis, and many others, I believe, were grossly unqualified, and even some of their editors were grossly unqualified under things like Comicsgate. So I believe there is a case for the shop owner to go out here and demand that Marvel and DC stop producing poor quality comics, because it is affecting the overall business of comic shops, and that also affects the overall business of the comic book industry, because we are losing comic shops basically every day, and we're losing comic shops because of the content that is being produced, because most comic shops make most of their money from selling comics, and if there's no quality comics on the shelf, then there's no reason for the customer to go out here and buy comics, and there's no way to build the readership, because the business that owns many of these comic publishers, Warner Brothers Discovery and Disney, they just see comics as just an ancillary part of their business, but it's a major part of a comic shop's business, because they depend on 90% of that income or 70% of that income from comics in order for them to make money, to be able to pay their bills and be able to make a living. So while Warner Brothers Discovery and Disney are only keeping these characters around for trademarks, many comic shops need these characters and their stories to be good in order for them to make their business strong. And that's where I believe that there's a case for a class action lawsuit, because too many comic shop owners are losing their business. And the core reason why they're losing their business is because Western comics are absolute garbage at this point. And the reason why Western comics are absolute garbage at this point is due to incompetent editorial that has been in place ever since, I say, the early 2000s. And if a class action lawsuit could be the thing that could make these corporations wake up and give us the actual shake up in management that could get standards back on comic shelves again. Now, if you want to pick up my first comic, Easting No Good Deed, you can find that comic on Kindle for 99 cents. And I'm hoping to get my second comic, John Haynes at Death's Door, available for sale on a platform like Lulu's. So that book will be available soon. But until then, you can pick up my other books in my fantasy series, like the ISIS series, the E-Steam series, and the John Haynes series, along with my vampire novel, Eternal Night, and my goth trilogy, the Spinsterella trilogy. You can find all of those books on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. You can also find them at other online booksellers like Smashwords, the iBookstore, and Google Play. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available in paperback, John Haynes at Death's Door. The man who rules the world takes on the Greek god of death in this action-packed John Haynes series adventure. Pick up your copy of John Haynes at Death's Door at Amazon.com and other online booksellers everywhere.